Welcome to Insight, produced in partnership with WDSC WRPT in Duluth, Minnesota. Today we are chatting with Kathleen Annette, President and CEO of the Blandin Foundation, who has generously agreed to share some of her experience with us. I'd like to thank you, Kathy, for joining us today.
Thank you.
So you loom very large, the foundation looms very large in strengthening civil society in various ways in this region. Talk about how you do that. And it's not just through grant making, which you do, you also provide other types of support as well.
We certainly do. The majority of what we do is grant making. However, we also have programs that have contributed greatly to rural Minnesota communities. For example, we have a leadership program, and we have trained over 7,000 people in rural Minnesota communities over the past couple of decades in terms of rural leadership.
And that's so important because although having means, getting a check, is really critical to the services that are shaped and delivered by these nonprofits, it's also the competency of the people to ensure that those services are delivered in a quality way. So how do you actually do this? When you say you do training, talk about how those training programs unfold.
The training programs are first well-designed programs to bring 26 people from a community together for an entire week. And they spend the entire week together learning to get to know each other and picking up a number of skills, both as individuals and leaders, but even more importantly, as a group, as a cohort. What can we do back home to make a change? So that is how we really do this, is bring up 26 people together for a week to go through a concentrated, really excellent leadership program. In addition to that, we follow up with them with workshops over a year, and we give them grants to accomplish some of the work that they identify together as a group. What's remarkable about this is you form peers, you form friends, you form others who know how to do this work with you. And those that are really successful keep at this once they get home.
And you're movement building, right? That's the whole idea. It comes from a place of respect. Respect that people within a community have their own solutions, they have their knowledge. They might lack some other knowledge, which you're helping them to build. But those solutions are going to come from within the community.
Absolutely. In fact, the work that we do in many ways comes from community. We listen to communities. We listen when communities tell us for our small rural communities to be successful, we have to have access to high-speed internet. We looked at this over 10 years ago, the broadband program that we have. We don't go in and do it for any community because you can't. Communities do it for themselves, but how can we best support you as you look at developing these programs, these ways of doing business, accessing broadband, for example, to make a difference?
Now, you've referred a number of times to the particular needs of rural communities. Could you talk a little bit about those needs? And then let's really delve into that, because the needs of rural communities are far different than communities that are in or proximate to a city.
They are. Rural needs, geography makes a difference. A certain distance makes a difference.
Weather makes a difference.
Weather makes a difference, particularly for us in Minnesota, correct? One of the things we do is we ask. We do this through a rural pulse study that we do every 2 to 3 years, and it's a perception study where we ask rural community members, what's important to you and what are some of the things you identify? And consistently things like jobs and the economy come up. Other things that seem to have emerged are health and the opioid addiction and crises that many of these rural communities are facing. Mental health has really emerged as one of the top areas of concern for our communities. So what we do is we say, how can we best assist these communities? Leadership is one way. Really looking at engaging communities in conversations is another. So one of the skills and talents and things that we really have out there is how do you create a space, bring people together to have really courageous conversations about some of these issues that are really important to them.
And certain attributes in rural communities act as multipliers: distance, sometimes communication issues, a feeling of isolation at times. When you think about the opioid crisis, for example, those issues can fester invisibly for so long until they explode into a full-blown crisis. And until that happens, one is clueless. But as we've seen from the opioid crisis, this really metastasized very, very quickly. So how do you ensure that not only communities, by bringing people together, these 26 people, you're creating communication, but how do you function as a way to take ideas from different community clusters and move them across Minnesota so that the ideas of one community can infect, in a good way, the actions of another?
Well, a big part of what we do is we do communicate. So all of these 7,000 folks we talk about, they have access to all of our communications, whether that's our blog, other social media, or Facebook. So there's ways for them to share what they've learned. That's one.
So you act as an information clearinghouse.
In many ways we do.
And a connector.
And bridging is a big part of what we do. And there's so much good work that's happening, and how do we connect these? So that is, again, that's one of the functions that I think we serve really do that pretty well.
In terms of your 33 staff, how are they organized to deal with communication, but also you need, if you're going to be making grants, you need certain expertise to evaluate a grant request. You have an administrative infrastructure. How are you organized?
We have an administrative infrastructure. We also have a grants team. We have a leadership team. We have a public policy and engagement team, which is pretty much our program team. And then we have a grants team. And a big part of what we do is when we work with a community, it's not just the grants team going in, it's not just the broadband, it's not just the leadership. How can we use our work collectively to best assist a community?
So you're coming in with people who already have been exposed to some of these ideas that other communities have applied, and then you're sharing that intelligence with that community, and then they decide to what extent these ideas are applicable to them?
That's part of it. The other part is if you go into any community, they have their own ideas, but they don't always have the resources to carry them out. And if we can connect their ideas to the resources, whether that's leadership development, whether that's some grants, whether that's really focusing conversations in their communities, there's different ways that we have worked with communities so that they can figure out what it is that will make their community strong and vibrant and healthy.
Now, there are different ethnic groups throughout this region and different traditions, different cultures. Talk about how you ensure that what you're doing and how you're communicating and the sensitivity. You know, I know with my background, as much as I listen and as much as it is my job to talk with different people with different issues, there are sometimes things that I'm just not equipped to hear. It just is true. Right? And being sensitive to your own deficiencies is part and parcel of listening. How do you ensure amongst your 33 people that you have people who can hear even the unspoken?
You know, for the past, I would say at least 20 years, we have been working at our own internal culture. We have looked at what is our intercultural competency of our organization and each of us as individuals.
How does that evolve? How did you start?
You start by just looking at your own culture. That's what we did. How can we start working across? First of all, you look, if you have silos internally, you're not going to do your best work in terms of serving a community.
Well, you started in 1941. The foundation actually was started in 90. So that, it must have looked a lot different in 1941.
It was very different. The board, for example, at that time was all white males. Staff, as we evolved and actually was pretty much a white staff, and they made a concerted effort that we're going to reflect the people that we serve, and that's what I think happened.
So that's the change, right?
The change is we started having women on the board. We have evolved into the most diverse board that I have seen on any boards, and I've sat on numerous boards that exist. We have so much that's reflected there in terms of race, ethnicity, sexual orientation. We've got like it all on our board. And the changes start at the top. The board actually said, we're going to include in our mission, our vision, our values, inclusion, equity. that's going to be embedded throughout everything that we look at and think. And it's tough. This is not easy work. We've been doing this internally for about 10 years, and it's changed the way we look at life. The 33 staff, it's pretty amazing. We have the leader of our leadership program is Native American. I'm the president and CEO. I'm Native American. We have women throughout the organization in leadership programs, and we have men. We have a diverse group that works together that are committed to this change. But it takes a while to get there. I kind of smile because we did this. There's an intercultural inventory you can take, which can kind of measure where you're at now, and a whole pathway of where you want to go. It's called the IDI. And we took it, and we scored like medium. We're kind of in minimization. Took it again, and kept doing all this stuff. And it took us years to move the needle, but we did. And once the needle moves as an organization, you look at the world differently. You're so much more curious. You don't jump to conclusions just based on what you think. And it's a really interesting place to be for an organization in terms of developing those muscles. Now we're starting to flex them. And what do I mean by that? We have policies in place now that we look at it through an inclusion or equity lens. For example, we allow more time for moving religious holidays. We're even thinking, can people work on Christmas if they're taking some other holiday off for what they believe? We're looking at all of that sort of thing, and how can we change to be accommodating to people and their beliefs? Not easy, no, but we think about it. We ask questions. What difference would this make? Does it really make a difference? And if the answer is yes, we have to find a way to do that. So our policies, the way we do business, we advertise every position now at the foundation so that people have an opportunity to apply. We still want the best people for the jobs, but there was a time when people like me, for example, may not even had a door open because things were set up that positions were filled before they even opened. Now we've said no. What we're going to do is we'll give this opportunity to all. Not guaranteeing anything to anybody, but at least the processes are in place and the opportunities are there.
Kathleen Annette, thank you so much for sharing the work of the Blandin Foundation, your grantees, your board members, your staff, and thank you so much for your insights.
Well, thank you.
Welcome to Insight, produced in partnership with WDSC WRPT in Duluth, Minnesota. Today we are chatting with Don Ness, Executive Director of the Ordean Foundation. Don has generously agreed to share some of his experience with us. I'd like to thank you, Don, for joining us today.
Oh, thank you.
So the Ordean Foundation has a particular mission and a particular way of executing its mission. Talk about the mission and how you execute it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Ordean is one of the Ordean Foundation is one of the oldest private foundations in Minnesota. It was established by Albert and Louise Ordean back in the 1930s, and they gave their substantial wealth to this foundation with the goal of addressing issues related to poverty in Duluth and surrounding communities. And the way that we approach that is by entering into kind of long-term relationships with our nonprofit partners. And we believe in kind of being the quiet, steady partner behind the scenes, giving support, not only financial support, but also kind of working with the staff and the executives of these nonprofits to deliver quality service and hopefully finding ways to address the issues of poverty in our community.
And the key is long-term because poverty isn't an event and it cannot be resolved by one investment. It really is, it requires sustained attention. How do you enter into an initial relationship? What prompts you to consider a partnership with someone who is focusing on education or children and families or health? How do you start that relationship off?
Yeah, that's a great question. Ordean does approach our giving in a slightly different way than you see oftentimes in philanthropy. Many times foundations will have competitive grant cycles in which they kind of say, we have all this money and we're looking for ideas. And that's a great way to distribute money and to help with startup. Ordean believes in the importance of the boots on the ground work, that sustained effort, and building capacity within our community to address these issues that you're absolutely right. They're deeply entrenched and they're systemic in many ways, and they're intergenerational, that oftentimes families can get stuck in poverty for generation after generation. And so the sustained effort through our partners' work in the neighborhoods and directly with families, we believe is the most effective way to address the issues of poverty. And we want the dollars that we give to our nonprofit partners to go to the greatest extent possible to direct service to the people in need.
So not to administrative overhead. You're looking at, if you're spending a certain amount of money, you want to know that that money is actually going to be experienced, the benefit of that money is going to be experienced by the end user.
Exactly. And that's one way, especially for foundations, that we can do that, is to ensure that they're not overspending on grant writing and overspending on reporting. For oftentimes nonprofits will spend a tremendous amount of time coming up with data and coming up with, meeting the needs of foundations, coming up with reports that then go into a file and are never seen again. Well, what's the good of that? We'd rather develop this kind of more intense and more intimate relationship. And so we have a very clear picture of what's happening on the ground within these organizations, because we take the time to meet with them face to face and understand their challenges, and having an honest type of conversation that they feel comfortable talking about their challenges, because they know that we're not going to pull dollars away from them because they're facing struggles.
In terms of that initial relationship, does it rely a lot on personal knowledge? In other words, a person-to-person communication, not only between the executives of the foundation and yourself and others and the organization, their boards, but also with the people who are the end users. How do you collect that intelligence?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, that it's both the understanding of the organization, the leadership, the staff, but then also having as much of a connection as we can to the end user, to the customer, to the client. What is their life experience? What are the struggles and the barriers that they have in making a better life for themselves and for their families? And so trying to see it as an integrated whole, that it's not a hierarchy, that here we are as a foundation and then the organization and then the end user at the bottom, but more of a spectrum in which we're all at the same level. We all have the similar goal. The organizations have a resource that we don't have, that we rely on their good work and the resources that they have working with the clients to fulfill our mission of addressing poverty issues. And we also see the client not as a recipient necessarily, but as a partner as well, that if they are treated with respect and dignity and seeing that they are part of this whole and we are successful when they are successful, that then I think we have better alignment in terms of our mission, and people feel better about the nature of that relationship rather than being put on edge saying, well, I better jump over this bar, otherwise there might be a punitive element to come.
How do you work with other foundations, other funders, other players here? Are you basically sort of dividing the market of need into areas where each of you specialize, or are there areas where you collaborate in order to achieve mutual objectives? And you are very place-based, so there are some foundations who have a broader geography. How does this whole dynamic work amongst the various large foundations here in this region?
Yeah, and most of the major players are place-based in our region. Duluth is not a community that has a tremendous number of big corporations. So we don't have the corporate foundations. We don't have the larger regional foundations, because those are based down in the Twin Cities. And from time to time, there are opportunities to work with those larger foundations, but most of their giving is also going to be in the metropolitan area. And so the key relationships are with the Northline Foundation, the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, Lloyd K. Johnson Foundation, which are all place-based, some just in Duluth, and most of them kind of a slightly broader regional approach. And I would like to say that I think the relationships there are good, but I think they could be better. I think there's opportunity for us to improve in our coordination in terms of our giving. Every organization holds, their autonomy in their giving very close to the vest, and they don't necessarily want to give that up. But through sharing of information, and especially the sharing of here's what we hope to accomplish as an organization, I think there's ways that we could better coordinate to maximize our efforts.
And your annual funding is about what?
We give about $1.4 to $1.5 million in giving every year.
And you have an enormous staff that manages that, right? With a lot of overhead, a lot of offices scattered around.
We are a staff of 2.5, and so we pride ourselves in being very efficient in our giving. And again, that allows us to maximize the amount that it's actually going to our nonprofit partners. And just for some perspective, there are organizations, foundations that have endowments that are twice as large as ours, or in some cases even 3 times as large as ours, and with pretty much the same level of giving. So and there are models that larger staff, and there are projects that larger staff can take on. We tend to say that the efficiency of our administration allows us to best maximize our impact in the community through our giving.
Now, you mentioned the core areas, basic needs: food, shelter, clothing, healthcare. How do you feel about the upstream factors that impact that? Lack of education, just poverty.
Right.
How do you think about that aspect of it? Because there is the immediate need, and without the immediate need being addressed, people will freeze to death. People will go hungry. So that's absolutely important. Are you also looking at some of these upstream factors?
Absolutely, and actually it's a change for Ordean. In the past, we've been almost exclusively focused on kind of the end result and making sure that people that are experiencing poverty have the resources and the support necessary to make their lives a little bit better and to allow them to live a productive life. But we're also recognizing that because we have this long-term approach, that if we can move further upstream and to have interventions that can give people support and maybe allow them to get on a life path that avoids poverty. And so we do make significant investments in youth programming in our traditional low-income neighborhoods. The idea that if these children can have a positive adult influence and can get help with their homework and can have a safe and supportive atmosphere after school and during their out-of-school time, that might encourage them or provide greater opportunities for them to avoid that cycle of poverty that is so entrenched. We also look a great deal at workforce issues, and much of our programming is designed to address those exiting incarceration. And it's a huge problem for folks that have done their time, they've served their debt to society, and oftentimes they are re-entering life, and they find all these barriers.
How do you see the role of business on the one hand, government on the other? Everybody's always complaining about too much taxes and too much regulation and too much this and too much that. It seems that all of our complaints come down to government, yet we have a government, and we created it, and we sustain it through our votes and through our taxes and so on. And then the nonprofit sector, which also fills in gaps. Where do you see the lines being drawn between these 3 sectors?
Wow. It's so important that we see that the challenges that we face as a society are shared challenges. And oftentimes I think we tend to say, well, here's a problem, and it's in that person's bucket, or it's their responsibility.
Kind of wash my hands, right?
Exactly.
Government will do it, or business will take care of it, or nonprofit, so I can wash my hands.
Right, and in some cases we're undercutting by, oftentimes people will complain about one sector or the other, and in doing so they're kind of washing their hands by being critical of the failures of a different group, rather than saying, I have responsibility to address this. And I think there's a real troubling trend in our society about kind of undercutting the strength of our institutions. And institutions can be, government institutions. It can be, institutions of civic society. It's the churches. It's the
Or
civic
institution
organization.
of commerce.
Exactly. And businesses have those responsibilities. And so as we weaken our institutions, they tend to narrow themselves and say, well, all I can really control and have influence over is this very narrow spectrum, and so I'm just going to focus on that and close myself off to the broader responsibilities of those institutions. So, but if we can invest in, support, encourage, and as a society kind of demonstrate that we value people that give their lives and their careers to strengthening institutions, rather than kind of looking for every opportunity to undercut those. And so I think that's one of the areas that government, the nonprofit sector, and the business sector have similarities. But I would really hope that we can encourage more collaboration and more common and shared ownership of the problems that we face.
Don Ness, thank you so much for sharing your ideas surrounding civil society, your leadership of the Ordean Foundation, and thank you so much for your insights.
Well, thank you.